Long before history learned to measure time in years and empires, before borders and calendars and recorded wars, there existed a land where humanity first learned how to remember. This land was Sumer, a flat, unforgiving stretch of earth between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where survival itself demanded intelligence, cooperation, and fear of forces beyond human control. The Sumerians did not merely live. They observed, they recorded, they wrote. In clay tablets pressed with reed styluses, they preserved the earliest known human memories, kingship lists, hymns, prayers, warnings, and stories of destruction so vast that even the gods seemed afraid of what they had unleashed. These tablets were not written for entertainment. They were written to remember what must never be forgotten. Sumer was a world governed by gods who were not distant abstractions, but volatile, emotional beings. Anu ruled the heavens, Enlil commanded storms and authority, Inanna embodied desire and war. These gods walked close to humanity, blessing cities one moment and erasing them the next. To the Sumerians, catastrophe was not random, it was intentional. Cities rose from mudbrick and ambition, Uruk, Lagash, Eridu. Each believed itself favored, protected, chosen. Each understood that favor could be withdrawn without warning, and when it was, the result was not slow decay, but sudden annihilation. The Sumerian texts speak often of the day the wind turned evil, of skies that darkened unnaturally, of fire descending not like lightning, but like judgment. Crops failed instantly. Rivers became bitter. Survivors wandered through silence where cities had stood only hours before. These were not poetic exaggerations written centuries later. Many of these tablets were administrative records, laments, and eyewitness-style accounts written close to the events they describe. Their language is clinical, restrained, and deeply unsettling. One recurring phrase appears again and again: the land was destroyed in a single day. To a modern reader, this raises an uncomfortable question. What kind of force can erase a city, its people, animals, structures, and soil, so completely and so suddenly that generations later the land remains cursed in memory? The Sumerians believed such destruction was deliberate, a decision made in the divine council, a weapon of punishment reserved for cities that had crossed an invisible line. But what exactly did they witness? Their descriptions speak of heat so intense that bricks melted, of a blast that flattened walls outward, of people turned into shadows, their bodies unrecognizable, of winds that burned instead of cooled, of rain that poisoned the earth rather than nourishing it. These accounts were preserved, copied, and guarded, not hidden but not explained either. The Sumerians assumed future generations would understand, or perhaps they hoped they never would. Far to the west, centuries later, another story would echo these same details. A story of two cities destroyed by fire from the sky, a story of salt, ash, and eternal desolation, a story the world would come to know as Sodom and Gomorrah. But before that name existed, before the Bible, before prophets and commandments, there were already warnings written into clay by trembling hands. This documentary does not begin with answers. It begins with records, with memories pressed into earth, with a civilization that may have seen something so overwhelming, so final, that it reshaped humanity's fear of the heavens forever. And the fire had not yet fallen. Buried beneath layers of dust, ash, and collapsed civilizations, the Sumerian tablets waited in silence for thousands of years. They did not decay, they did not forget. Pressed into clay while it was still wet, then hardened by fire and time, these records survived floods, wars, and the rise and fall of empires. When modern archaeologists finally uncovered them, they expected myths, prayers, and royal boasts. What they found instead were warnings. Not prophecies, memories. Among administrative lists and hymns lie texts that do not celebrate victory or divine mercy, but describe devastation with a tone that is disturbingly restrained. These are not heroic epics. They read like reports written by people who witnessed something they could not fully comprehend. One of the most unsettling sources is the collection known as the City Laments. These tablets mourn the destruction of entire cities, describing how life was erased not gradually, but instantly. Streets once crowded with voices became silent. Temples collapsed outward as if struck by an invisible force. The air itself became hostile. The texts describe a storm sent by the gods, but this storm does not behave like wind or rain. It burns, it blinds, it kills in moments. Survivors do not flee from flooding waters, but from heat so intense that it scorches skin and turns breath into pain. In one passage, the destruction is described as arriving with the brilliance of heaven. Another speaks of a light so powerful that night became day. This light is followed by a wind that flattens walls and carries death far beyond the city center. Modern translators have long debated these phrases. Are they metaphors, religious exaggeration, or attempts to describe a phenomenon for which no vocabulary yet existed? The tablets go further. They speak of land that could no longer sustain life, of fields that refused to grow crops long after the cities were gone, of water that tasted bitter and sickened those who drank it. This was not temporary devastation, it was permanent. In Sumerian belief, this was the result of a divine decision, a verdict passed in the heavenly council. Enlil, god of authority and storms, is often named as the executor. The destruction is portrayed not as chaos, but as controlled force, targeted, precise, final. One phrase appears repeatedly in different texts, across different cities and centuries. The city was struck as if by a weapon. To ancient scribes, this may have been symbolic language. To modern readers, it is impossible not to pause. Weapons imply intent, design, power wielded rather than unleashed by accident. What makes these tablets even more unsettling is what they do not say. There is no long battle, no invading army, no warning horns or sieges. The destruction comes from above, from the sky, without time to escape. Archaeologists have noted that some of the cities mentioned in these laments show signs of extreme heat exposure, melted bricks, fused materials, sudden abandonment. These observations alone do not prove anything extraordinary, but when paired with the language of the tablets, they raise questions that refuse to remain buried. The Sumerians copied these texts again and again, long after the original events had passed. Each generation preserved the memory as if fearful that forgetting would invite repetition. The tablets were not hidden away. They were taught, read aloud, remembered. These were not stories meant to inspire faith. They were stories meant to inspire caution. Because if the gods had once chosen to erase cities in fire and wind, then the sky was never truly safe again. And somewhere beyond Sumer, beyond time itself, the same pattern would reappear. Another land, another warning, another fire falling from above. The tablets end without explanation, no comfort, no resolution. Only silence hardened into clay. Long after the Sumerian scribes pressed their warnings into clay, another civilization inherited the same fear of the sky. This time, the record was not written on tablets, but woven into scripture, preserved not as lament, but as moral reckoning. The story was given names, and those names were Sodom and Gomorrah. According to the book of Genesis, these cities stood in a fertile plain, prosperous and alive. They were not ruins awaiting destruction. They were thriving until, in a single night, they ceased to exist. The text does not describe a siege, an earthquake, or a slow-burning fire. It describes sudden annihilation. Fire and brimstone fell from the heavens. The words are simple, their implications are not. The account speaks of a light so intense that it could be seen from afar, of a blast that arrived without warning, of destruction so complete that even those attempting to flee were overtaken in moments. One figure looks back and is instantly turned into a pillar of salt, frozen in death by forces never explained. To ancient readers, this was divine punishment. To modern readers, it reads like a physical event described by people without scientific language. Extreme heat, sudden flash, lethal exposure, immediate fatality. The cities were not merely burned, they were erased. The land itself was transformed. Scripture describes the region afterward as barren, lifeless, incapable of sustaining growth. Smoke rose like a furnace long after the event had ended. The destruction did not pass quietly into memory. It left a scar on geography. For centuries, theologians treated this as allegory, a warning against moral decay, but archaeology forced the question back into the physical world. Cities cannot vanish symbolically. Soil does not become sterile because of metaphor. In the eastern Jordan Valley, near what many scholars believe to be the region described in Genesis, excavations revealed something unexpected. Evidence of sudden, high-temperature destruction, melted pottery, shock-fractured materials. A city abandoned instantly, not resettled for centuries. Tall el-Hammam. The site showed signs of a violent event occurring around the Middle Bronze Age. Walls collapsed outward, human remains fragmented, minerals exposed to temperatures far beyond conventional fires. This was not gradual warfare, it was instantaneous. Researchers proposed a cosmic explanation, a meteor airburst, similar to the Tunguska event. A blast of energy from above that never touched the ground, yet released heat and force capable of leveling a city. Others went further. They noticed parallels that refused to be ignored. The same sudden light, the same burning wind, the same poisoned land, the same silence afterward, the same language, different culture, same fear. Could the biblical writers have inherited older memories? Could Sodom and Gomorrah be the echo of a catastrophe remembered first by Sumer, then retold through generations until it entered Scripture? The Bible never names the weapon, it never explains the mechanism, it simply records the result, and like the Sumerian tablets, it offers no comfort. Both accounts insist on the same truth: the destruction came from above. It was swift, it was total, and it left the survivors convinced they had witnessed the judgment of something far more powerful than themselves. Whether divine, cosmic, or something yet unnamed, the event shattered the illusion that cities were permanent, that walls could protect, that the sky was benign. Sodom and Gomorrah did not fall in battle. They were erased. And once again, humanity looked upward and learned to fear the heavens. For thousands of years, the destruction of ancient cities was explained through myth, theology, and moral storytelling. Fire from the heavens was the language of gods, not of physics. But in the modern age, the earth began to speak for itself, and what it revealed was deeply unsettling. Archaeology does not interpret symbolism, it records damage. When scientists and excavators examined sites linked to ancient catastrophic accounts, they were not searching for divine punishment. They were measuring temperatures, fracture patterns, and material transformation. What they found challenged comfortable explanations. At Tall el-Hammam, layers of destruction told a clear story. This was not slow conquest. There were no signs of prolonged warfare, no gradual burn layers, no rebuilding phase. Instead, the city ended abruptly. Walls were blown outward, not inward. Structures collapsed in the same direction. Human remains showed fragmentation consistent with extreme pressure. Even more troubling were the materials themselves. Pottery shards were partially vitrified, glassed by exposure to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. Mud brick walls had melted and fused. Sand grains had transformed into glass-like formations. These are temperatures that ordinary fires cannot produce. Even ancient kilns struggle to reach such extremes. Something had flash-heated the city. Chemical analysis of the soil revealed elevated levels of salts and unusual mineral distributions, rendering the land infertile for generations. Crops could not grow. Settlements did not return. The land remembered what happened, even when people tried to forget. This pattern was not unique. Across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to the Levant, archaeologists identified sites that appeared to have been killed rather than conquered. Entire urban centers wiped out in moments, followed by centuries of abandonment. The destruction layers were thin, violent, and absolute. Science demanded an explanation. One theory gained traction among mainstream researchers: a cosmic airburst. similar to the Tunguska event of 1908, where a meteor exploded in the atmosphere over Siberia, releasing energy equivalent to a large nuclear detonation without leaving a crater. The blast flattened forests. It produced intense heat. It devastated everything beneath it. Such an event over an ancient city would have been catastrophic. A blinding flash, a firestorm, a shockwave, instant death for anyone exposed, no warning, no survivors near the epicenter. This explanation satisfied many questions, but not all. Some features remained difficult to reconcile: the precision of destruction, the repeated descriptions across cultures, the language of weapons and judgment, the emphasis on targeted cities rather than random devastation. And then there was the heat. Meteor airbursts can generate extreme temperatures, but certain vitrified materials suggested heat exposure that was not just intense, but sustained for brief, devastating moments. Enough to melt stone, yet not long enough to ignite everything conventionally. This is where speculation began to grow, cautiously, reluctantly. A small group of researchers and independent analysts began asking an uncomfortable question: what if ancient people witnessed something that looked, felt, and behaved like a weapon, something controlled, something unleashed deliberately? The idea was not embraced. It was resisted, because accepting it would force humanity to confront a possibility that history had always insisted was impossible, that advanced destructive technology existed long before modern civilization, or that forces beyond our understanding intervened directly. Mainstream science does not endorse this conclusion, but it cannot entirely silence the question either. The archaeological record does not claim gods. It does not say nuclear. It simply shows damage consistent with sudden, overwhelming energy released from above. And when these findings are placed beside the Sumerian tablets and biblical accounts, a pattern emerges that feels less like coincidence and more like repetition. Fire from the sky, blinding light, burning wind, poisoned land, cities erased in a single day. Science did not solve the mystery. It made it impossible to ignore. At the edge of accepted history lies a theory most scholars refuse to name aloud, not because it has been proven false, but because of what it would imply if even partially true. This theory suggests that the ancient world did not merely witness natural catastrophe, but something that behaved like advanced weaponry. The idea of an ancient nuclear war does not originate in science fiction. It emerges from pattern recognition, from the uncomfortable alignment of ancient descriptions, physical evidence, and modern understanding of energy release. Proponents of the hypothesis point first to language. Across Sumerian tablets, biblical scripture, and later epics like the Mahabharata, the same imagery appears again and again. A blinding light brighter than the sun, heat that incinerates instantly, winds that burn flesh, cities erased in moments, survivors sickened afterward, lands rendered barren for generations. To a modern mind, these are not poetic abstractions. They resemble the effects of nuclear detonation. In the 20th century, humanity witnessed such forces for the first time, or so we believed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed what happens when overwhelming energy is released in an instant. Shadows burned into stone, buildings flattened outward, people vaporized where they stood, radiation poisoning that lingered long after the explosion ended. When researchers compared these modern effects with ancient ruins, the parallels were disturbing. In some ancient sites, skeletons have been found lying unburied, as if death came too suddenly for ritual or escape. Walls collapsed uniformly, materials exposed to heat levels inconsistent with known ancient technology. Stories of cities cursed long after their destruction. The nuclear war hypothesis does not claim certainty, it claims resemblance. Critics argue that meteor airbursts, volcanic activity, and natural disasters can explain most of the evidence without invoking advanced weapons. They caution against projecting modern fears onto ancient texts, and they are correct to do so. Yet skepticism cuts both ways. Meteor impacts are random. They do not target cities with moral narratives attached. They do not repeat the same symbolic language across civilizations separated by time and distance. They do not inspire generations to write warnings rather than celebrations. Those who support the hypothesis ask a more unsettling question. What if ancient people were not describing technology they understood, but technology they survived? The theory branches into possibilities, none comfortable. A lost advanced civilization destroyed itself, intervention by non-human intelligence, or misunderstood natural forces perceived as intentional acts. Mainstream archaeology rejects these conclusions due to lack of direct proof. There are no reactors, no machines, no blueprints, only ruins, records, and fear. But absence of proof is not proof of absence, especially when destruction itself is the evidence. What makes the hypothesis endure is not certainty, but consistency. The same details recur, the same sequence unfolds: light, heat, wind, silence, poisoned land, memory preserved as warning. The ancient writers never glorified these events. They mourned them, they feared them, they begged the future not to repeat their mistakes. If this was a war, it was not fought between nations. It was fought between power and restraint lost. Whether nuclear in nature or not, the hypothesis forces a realization that is difficult to escape. Humanity's greatest danger may not be invention, but forgetting. Because if such power once existed, and if it was lost, then history is not a straight line of progress. It is a cycle, and cycles repeat. When the fire faded and the winds fell silent, there were no victors left to tell the story. Only survivors, and even they struggled to find words. What remained was ash, broken stone, and a fear that would outlive empires. Civilizations do not remember triumph as carefully as they remember extinction. The ancient world preserved these stories not as legends of glory, but as warnings. Sumerian scribes carved them into clay. Biblical writers sealed them into scripture. Each generation inherited the same unease, the sense that something once descended from the sky and reminded humanity how fragile it truly was. What matters most is not whether the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was nuclear, cosmic, or divine. What matters is that multiple civilizations, separated by time and culture, described the same sequence with chilling consistency. A sudden light, unbearable heat, a burning wind, cities erased in moments, land rendered silent for generations. These are not the fears of a peaceful world, they are the memories of trauma. The ancient writers never claimed mastery over the forces that destroyed them. They spoke with humility, dread, and restraint. They believed that knowledge itself carried danger, that to forget was to invite repetition. In the modern age, humanity stands beneath the same sky, armed with weapons that ancient people could only describe as gods. We now understand the physics of annihilation. We can calculate the temperatures, measure the blast radius, predict the silence afterward. And yet, the ancient warnings feel uncomfortably relevant. If the nuclear war hypothesis is wrong, then these stories are still a lesson in humility before nature's power. If it is even partially correct, then history has already shown us the end of that path. Either way, the message remains unchanged. Civilization is not permanent, technology does not guarantee wisdom, and the sky has never been harmless. The ruins do not argue, they do not persuade. They simply exist, mute witnesses to an event that reshaped memory itself. Every melted stone and abandoned city asks the same question without words. Did humanity learn anything? As the sun sets over the deserts of Mesopotamia and the Jordan Valley, the earth appears calm again. But beneath the sand lie records pressed into clay and stone, reminders that the world has burned before, and that it could burn again. History does not scream its warnings. It whispers them.